Hey now. So here lately I've been doing a lot of talking about ordering a MegaSquirt for my Miata. So I thought it might be worth it to make a quick video that explains really what the hell I'm talking about. What is a MegaSquirt? Why would you even want one? So we're gonna start with how your car works from the factory, and just as a little bit of a disclaimer, this is just kind of like a general simplified version of how things work. I'm not going to go into super great detail, number one, because every car is different and it would take forever to go through all the variations, and number two, because it doesn't really matter. This is just to give you a general idea of how an aftermarket standalone ECU works. So the ECU that comes in your car, well, I guess we should first define an ECU. That would be an engine control unit, also called an ECM, engine control module, also sometimes called a PCM, powertrain control module, though that usually means that it controls the transmission too, but not always. But I'm just going to use ECU to mean the computer that controls the engine in your car. So the way the factory one works is it is pre-programmed from the factory to target a specific air-fuel ratio for a given situation. An air-fuel ratio is exactly what it sounds like. It's how much fuel you need for a given amount of air going into the engine. Ideally, or at least the perfect air-fuel ratio for a gasoline engine is 14.7 to 1. So 1 part fuel for every 14.7 parts air. That is called stoichiometric. That means that it burns all of the fuel and there's just enough air to combust all of the fuel and no extras left over. You know, if you have extra air left over, then you have a lean condition. If you have extra fuel left over, then you have a rich condition. So what the factory ECU does is looks at the sensors, mass airflow usually on a stock car that tells them the amount of air coming in, intake air temperature tells them the temperature of the air coming in, and throttle position will tell the computer how much gas you're giving it, if you have it to the floor, if you're idling, if you're just cruising down the road, whatever. So it looks at all these sensors, determines what you're doing, and looks up in its pre-programmed from the factory table the air-fuel ratio it thinks that situation calls for, and then tells the injectors to, you know, fire off for a given amount of time to achieve that air-fuel ratio. Then the narrowband oxygen sensor in your exhaust checks the exhaust to see how close they were. That will basically measure the air-fuel ratio from your exhaust. So let's say you're cruising down the road and you're just, you know, driving normally, like going down a flat highway at 45 in 5th gear. It's probably going to ask for 14.7 to 1. So it looks at all these sensors, determines that you're not trying to go fast, you don't have it to the floor, the throttle angle is low, there's not a huge amount of air coming in, there's not much load on the engine, and goes, okay, we want 14.7 to 1. Tells the injectors to fire to, you know, achieve that air-fuel ratio for the given amount of air that it's measured coming into the engine, and then checks it with the narrowband oxygen sensor in your exhaust and goes, okay, that was pretty close, we're a little bit rich, we'll pull a little bit of fuel out of that cell. And then it keeps going like that. So that sounds like a pretty good system, right? And it is for stock or even close to stock, but you do run into some limitations when you try and do things that the factory engineers never had in mind when they built that engine, or at least that engine in your car. For example, if your car didn't come with a turbo or supercharger, there's probably no way for it to even know what boost is. If it does have a map sensor, there's no reason for the map sensor to read above atmospheric pressure, because there's no way your engine's ever going to have more than atmospheric pressure unless it has a turbocharger. So that's the first shortcoming. The factory ECU has effectively no way of knowing what the hell boost even is, much less what to do about it. The other thing too is there are limits to what it can read, and those limits are going to be based on what it was in a stock configuration. For example, if your engine can flow a maximum of, say, 200 or so CFM, there's really no reason for the mass air meter to read much more than that. It makes more sense to scale it to where, 0 is none, and then maximum voltage at the sensor is a bit more than what they think it's going to read, just to compensate for changes in altitude, changes in temperature, stuff like that, because all of those will actually affect the flow rate through your engine. But there's no reason for it to be capable of reading 2 or 3 times the amount of airflow they're expecting in the factory configuration. So basically, if you're stuffing another, oddly enough, even though they're not related, 1 bar, that is atmospheric pressure at sea level, is 14.7 psi. No relation to the 14.7 air-fuel ratio, just kind of one of those things that ended up like that. But at any rate, so if you're stuffing another 14.7 psi, that is 14.7 psi of positive manifold pressure boost, then you're going to roughly double the amount of air flowing through the mass air meter and flowing into the engine. The mass air meter is probably not going to even be capable of reading that, and since it doesn't know that it's boost, it has no way to correctly fuel for that. See, 14.7 to 1 air-fuel ratio is correct for low load situations, but you actually are going to want to run richer than that in a lot of situations. Pretty much anytime there's a large throttle opening or a lot of load on the engine, you're going to want to run richer than that to prevent detonation. The extra fuel helps keeps the combustion chamber cool and prevents detonation. So, for example, a naturally aspirated car, that is no turbo or supercharger, no forced induction, at wide open throttle, like when you really nail it to the floor and you're running through the gears, it's probably going to command an air-fuel ratio of 13 to 1, 13.5 to 1, somewhere in there. But because a turbocharger makes the air both hotter from compressing it and increases cylinder pressure, you actually want to run even richer than that. Most turbo cars are tuned somewhere between 12 to 1 and 12.5 to 1 when they're under boost. So even if the factory ECU could measure that much airflow, it still wouldn't know the difference between that amount of airflow naturally aspirated as it came from the factory, which probably commands an air-fuel ratio somewhere in the 13s, and the fact that it's actually seeing boost and it needs to be even richer than that. A standalone ECU, like the MegaSquirt, on the other hand, can, number one, see boost because it'll have a map sensor built into it or connected to it. And this map sensor will be one that is capable of reading pressures in excess of normal atmospheric pressure. It'll be able to see boost, basically, is the short version. So what you can do with your standalone ECU is you can tell it, I want, stoichiometric air-fuel ratios at part throttle, low load situations, and then I want to get progressively richer as we get closer to positive manifold pressure, and then once I start seeing boost, I want to get even richer. So it can actually see the boost. It won't be limited by the factory airflow meter because it will use other means, a VE table more specifically, which I won't get into, but that's a thing. And it'll be able to properly fuel for all of these situations in a way that basically mimics the drivability of your factory ECU, but with the added benefits of being able to see all the other stuff you have going on, the positive manifold pressure, anything else you've changed, you can tune for it. You can program, instead of the factory setting what air-fuel ratio they want for a given situation, you can, and you can actually see positive manifold pressure and stuff like that. And most of them, like the MegaSquirt, also come with things like, boost control built in. I mentioned that the factory ECU uses a narrowband O2 sensor. What that means is it's able to determine air-fuel ratio between about 14 to 1 and 15 to 1. But if you remember a couple of minutes ago, me saying the best air-fuel ratios when you're, on it, those were not in that range. Even for naturally aspirated motors, you're going to probably want to run richer than 14 to 1. So standalone ECUs pretty much universally employs something called a wideband O2. And the wideband O2 is actually capable of accurately reading air-fuel ratios all the way down from like 8 or 9 to 1 up to well over 15, 17, 20 to 1. The standalone ECU is going to be, you're going to be able to program it and say, okay, now when I'm at full boost, or even any positive manifold pressure, whatever, when I'm under boost, I don't want 14.7 to 1, I don't want 13.5 to 1, I want 12 to 1 or 12.3 to 1 or something like that. And the wideband oxygen sensor is actually going to be able to accurately measure that. And you know, it will be able to target an air-fuel ratio outside of that narrow band that your narrow band O2 sensor for your factory ECU can read. So basically, that's like half the magic of a standalone, is you can program it to do whatever you want, and when paired with a wideband, which they pretty much all are, you can actually measure it and see if it's doing that. And then it can do things like auto-tune, like most modern standalones have, to where you set the target air-fuel ratio, and then you go drive around with it in learning mode, and it uses your wideband and will actually change your fuel map to achieve the air-fuel ratio you want for a given situation. Most of them, and certainly the one that I bought, are actually plug and play, so you don't have to wire up all new sensors. It'll use mostly or entirely the sensors that came with the car, so that makes things easy. So that's basically why you would want a standalone, particularly if you're going to go with any kind of forced induction on a car that did not come with forced induction from the factory. I think that about covers it. Like I said, this is kind of a quick and dirty, basic, you know, standalone 101 explainer, because as I go through installing and tuning mine on the Miata, assuming it ever actually ships and shows up, which I think it actually has soon, but assuming it ever actually shows up, I'm going to go through and make more videos of more specific and in-depth things. But I thought it might be useful for people to understand what the hell a MegaSquirt is. It's a standalone ECU. What is a standalone ECU? Well, it replaces the factory one and lets you do more stuff, and also is totally capable of seeing boost, unlike most factory ECUs on a car that was naturally aspirated from the factory. And why would you want one? Well, because you want to be able to fuel your engine correctly so that it does not blow up. I think that about covers it for this very basic introductory video, and I will be back shortly with my actual installation. I have everything else here except for the standalone. I have my wideband, went with an AEM, and the X series, because it has, you can connect it to the MegaSquirt through the CAN inputs, which means it's like all digital, it's not an analog signal. It's good stuff. I'll get into that later. So I went with that, bought a cheap autometer boost gauge, bought an A-pillar gauge pod, you know, stuff like that. So I've definitely got some stuff coming up, but thought this explainer might be useful. Why are there so many dogs barking? I don't like it. Okay, well, as soon as my parts show up, I'll be back with another video of me actually doing some work to this unit. Until then, later.